Hello, I'm Jesse Griffin, and today I'd like to talk to you about voting. Has anyone ever thought about how our government and society would be if no one voted? It's a sad fact, but voter turnout in the United States elections have dropped 6% as compared to the last election's turnout. Voter turnout in the United States, however, is still lower than Canada, 49% for the U.S. compared to Canada's 57.5%. However, too often it is assumed that those who do not vote are lazy, while in reality low voter turnout can signify a lack of true alternatives to a government in power. According to an argument put forth by a group of American scholars, low voter turnout in the United States can be attributed to the lack of a viable working class party which promotes more egalitarian policies. Therefore, instead of choosing a vote for a party which does not represent their views, a fairly substantial number of Americans choose not to vote at all. One of the greatest advantages of a system of voluntary voting is the ability a citizen has to send a message to the government by not voting at all. Low voter turnout are often a symptom of elections in which political parties do not generate the interest of eligible voters. Both those in power and those attempting to gain power become aware that they must better represent the voter if they intend to increase these numbers, and thereby use the democratic process to create new policies, which they believe best represents those who are not voting. One politician who supports this opinion is Senator Nick Minchin of Australia. The level of voter turnout under voluntary voting is a very useful barometer of the people's attitude to their political system. In countries where compulsory voting is often difficult to determine whether the voters are truly satisfied with choices available, they are forced by their government to make a choice, whether they like it or not. This often results in several spoiled ballots and the same ineffective government in power for several years. Some political scholars, such as Andrew Coy, believe that because you are forced to pay your taxes and pay for your car insurance, you should be forced to vote as well. What these people fail to realize is that paying taxes and car insurance is mandatory because there is a general understanding that beneficial services will be provided. But voting is a different process entirely because it's predicated upon the concept of choice. The great importance of decision making often lies in the ability one has to make no choice at all if they believe the service provided is not beneficial. A forced choice is not a choice at all. Whenever compulsory voting is mentioned in a favorable light, the Australian system is usually put forward as a successful example. The numbers are indeed impressive. After Australia introduced a system of compulsory voting in which those who do not vote are issued a monetary fine in 2008, the voter turnout increased by an average of 23.2% and has remained at levels of around 90% ever since. Without further investigation, these numbers may appear staggeringly in favor of compulsory voting, but in actuality, the Australian electoral system is probably as ineffective as it was prior to the introduction of compulsory voting. In fact, in recent years, the Australian Liberal Party members and the Australian Federal Council have been advocating the abandonment of the system of compulsory voting. America's system of compulsory voting suffers from many flaws, most notably a high percentage of voter fraud and uninformed voters, which leads to a very little change in political parties in power. A minority report commissioned by the Australian Liberal and National Party members found that compulsory voting encouraged electoral fraud because minimal barriers were in place to prevent fraudulent voting and enrollment. Another report released in 2004 by the Civics Expert Group found that compulsory voting had done very little to increase voter knowledge. One major finding was that only 40% of the population could name 2 Australian Houses of Parliament. These same people, having very little knowledge of their own political system, are forced by the government to make political decisions without even having a basic understanding of how that system works. The Australian system of compulsory voting also seems to favor whatever party is in power, because those who are uninformed about political matters are more likely to vote for whatever name or party that is most familiar to them. In order for democracy to work most effective, it must be reinforced by a population who have faith in it. By forcing someone to vote, the government is enforcing its citizens to believe in democracy, creating a false idea which has no real foundation. One political scholar who believes that forced democracy is not democracy at all is Clifford Orwin. Just what would such an increase of votes due to compulsory voting signify? Only that votes were formerly free, and for that very reason significant, have become unfree and thus less so, that votes have once attested to uncoerced decisions on the part of those who cast them now attest to coerced ones. And in conclusion, it is every American's right to vote who is authorized to vote. So don't be swayed. Choose your representatives that best serve you. Thank you.